Okay, camera on. You can see me. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest Fairer Finance webinar. Over the next hour, we're going to be talking about consumer testing, when to do it, how to do it, and when not to do it. I'm delighted that we're joined by two excellent speakers from the FCA. Joe Legg is the FCA's Head of Consumer Policy and Outcomes, and Cameron Belton is a behavioural economist and technical specialist at the FCA. And just to keep things symmetrical, we're fielding two people from Fairer Finance with almost identical job titles. Tim is our very own behavioural economist, but also a director here at Fairer Finance, and Eve is our Head of Consumer Duty. So in a moment, we're going to hear a short presentation from Joe and Cameron, after which Tim and Eve will talk you through some of our experiences and lessons from the many consumer testing projects that we've done with our clients over the last few years. After that, Eve will be chairing a discussion with Joe, Cameron and Tim, and that'll be your chance to ask any questions. You can put your questions into the Q&A or the chat at any time during or after the presentations, and we'll try and get through as many as we can before the hour's up. That's almost it for me, but before I hand over to Joe and Cameron, I want to give a quick plug for our podcast, which we release every 2 weeks. In each episode, we discuss the latest regulatory, industry and political news in the financial services sector, discussing what it means for companies and consumers. So if you've not yet given it a go, there's 15 episodes to catch up on, and you can download it wherever you get your podcast. Today's webinar and slides will be available to download from our website over the next day or so. So if you've got any colleagues who you think would find it useful, feel free to reach out to us after the event and we can send you the pack, or you can download it yourself from our site. And of course, if you'd like to talk to us about your own consumer testing needs or any other work related to consumer duty, our specialist subject, please do get in touch. Okay, that's the advert out of the way. Time for today's feature presentation. As I said, delighted to welcome Joe and Cameron from the FCA. Joe and Cameron, over to you.
Thanks very much and afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and a big thanks to Fairer Finance for the invitation to what promises to be a fascinating discussion. Today's session is focused on something that's really central to the consumer duty, and that is helping consumers genuinely understand the products and services they're engaging with every day, which matter hugely in their lives. So if we can just move to the next slide, please. Now, we know from last year's FCA Financial Lives survey that around 3 in 5 UK adults have low to moderate confidence in managing their money, and that includes around 1 in 5 who tell us that their confidence in working with numbers in everyday life is low. A similar proportion score as having poor financial numeracy when they're asked questions to test basic understanding of things like interest rates and inflation, which are concepts that are used, consistently across the financial services industry. Also, when we looked at firms' communications during our recent review of firms' treatment of customers in vulnerable circumstances, we saw that even well-intentioned messaging might not help consumers, especially those with characteristics of vulnerability. So the consumer understanding outcome is really all about making sure your customers can engage with what you're offering, whether that's understanding fees, risks, how to complain, to help them take effective decisions. And in the right circumstances, testing can help you move from we think this is clear to we know this works for the majority of our customers. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I will say up front, we absolutely don't expect firms to test every communication before it's sent. Our rules and our guidance are really clear that testing is required where appropriate, and we know that firms come in different sizes and complexities. There are over 40,000 firms regulated under the consumer duty. So what's appropriate for one firm might not be reasonable or appropriate for another, and sometimes testing might not be the answer. If we go to the next slide, please. I'll shortly pass to my colleague Cameron, who works in our behavioural insights team, as James said, at the FCA, and he's going to talk about some examples of how, if you choose to test, you can make it most useful and most impactful. But before I do, there are just a few broad points on how you can decide when testing is the right step for your firm that I wanted to cover. A really good first question is whether you're putting the same weight behind ensuring your communications are delivering good consumer outcomes as you would to ensure your communications help to generate sales and revenue. And there are 4 other factors that it's worth considering too. First, purpose. What's the communication trying to do? Is it to encourage people to take a significant action, or rather a simple information update? Second, context. How complicated is the communication? How many people will it affect? And what would the harm be if it was misunderstood or overlooked? Third, timing and frequency. When will customers get the message and how often might they get it? And fourth, the information needs and vulnerabilities of the recipients, including whether there might be significant numbers of individuals with low financial capability who might be less likely to understand the communication. And those 4 areas provide a really solid framework to guide your efforts and take a judgment on whether testing is appropriate or not. And that's really what we want to see, the rationale behind the decision to test or not. We know it can be a really tricky area. You might not have perfect data, a full research team or research team at all, but that's okay. The duty doesn't expect perfection, it expects progress. So that's firms taking reasonable steps to learn and to improve. And just before I hand over to Cameron, I'll do one real world example of how testing can make a difference. In one of our pieces of thematic work, we saw a funeral plan provider test a range of documents from across its customer journey with customer focus groups. And through that testing, the firm identified that it was difficult for consumers to understand how to change or to cancel their plans, and they made changes accordingly to try and address that. The results, better informed consumers who understood how to manage a product that can be really very emotive. And that's the kind of impact that thoughtful testing and simplification can have. It's about building confidence and helping people take action. So today's session is all about supporting you in that journey of learning and improvement, because when you get it right, it shouldn't just improve understanding for your customers, it should also help build trust, strengthen relationships, and lead to better outcomes for everybody. So with that, I will hand over to Cameron.
Thanks, Joe, and good afternoon all. I'm really delighted to be talking to you all today. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I plan to share some insights or considerations that you might give to help you to think about and determine if, when, and how it might be appropriate and proportionate for you and your firm to test. Next slide, please. I think first, though, when it comes to consumer understanding and testing, what do we really mean? Well, I think testing can take many different forms, but ultimately it's a way of investigating or validating or evaluating your communications, customer journeys, or other relevant materials with customers, or at least people resembling your customers from the public, to generate insights and provide evidence. And of course, the purpose of these insights and evidence is to give you confidence you are delivering good outcomes for your customers under the consumer understanding outcome. And there are a number of different methods that can be used to support testing consumer understanding. I'll discuss each of these approaches in a bit more detail shortly, and Fairer Finance will talk you through some case studies of these types of testing in action. Move on to the next slide, please. But before we do that, I just want to share some reflections on why we see such value in testing. Now, over the past 10 years or so, testing has been a really key tool for the behavioural economics team at the FCA, and this includes testing understanding of many regulated communications, disclosures and customer journeys in different regulated sectors. And this work, alongside decades of wider behavioural science research, has really reinforced to us at least the value of testing consumer understanding. And for this, we see 4 key benefits. So first, we know that relatively small differences in information can have a big impact. So this includes the wording of the information, but it also includes the layout. So things like the order of information, the amount of information, or what's made salient. All of this can influence understanding. And testing is therefore important to understand what, where, and how these tweaks and changes can be made in a way that helps your customers. We also know that consumers' attitudes and behaviours can be context dependent. And this means that the exact approach for understanding in one domain or product may not work as well in another. And equally, what works well for one type of consumer may not necessarily work well for others. Now, that is not to say that learnings in one communication cannot be really useful in informing others. And nor does it mean that every communication needs multiple versions tailored to different groups. But it does reinforce how important it is to consider the specific context and the customer base that are intended to receive a communication when designing and importantly testing. Testing also helps to overcome the curse of knowledge. So all of us here today, myself included, we're likely to have a much better knowledge of financial products and services than the average consumer. But just being aware of this fact isn't necessarily enough to overcome it when designing communications and customer journeys that are intended to work for customers. And again, that's where testing helps. It can ensure that materials can be designed with customers' needs explicitly built into that process, so they're more likely to work for them and their understanding needs. And lastly, as Joe mentioned, the benefits of improved understanding as a result of testing are not zero-sum. Improving customers' understanding may lead to improved consumer trust and confidence and willingness to interact with financial products and services, which results in benefits not only for customers, but for firms and wider industry too. Next slide, please. So if we see the value of testing, it's reasonable that the next question is what, when, and how can testing be done? And testing can help throughout the life cycle of a communication or a customer journey. So for example, in designing new materials, testing can help to understand how to develop these in a way that works well for customers from the get-go. And it can also help you to understand what is or is not working well in existing materials. And of course, where potential improvements are identified, testing can help to improve those existing materials. Now, Joe's already shared some great examples of considerations that could help firms to decide how to prioritize when to test, but I'd add to this the potential value of data and management information, which could help to identify risks and support prioritization of where testing understanding could be valuable. So, for example, response rates to communications or dropout in a customer journey. Perhaps reporting rates of actions taken or perhaps even not taken as a consequence of communications. So for example, things like take-up rates or switching rates or claims rates, or simply whether or not customers are following instructions as expected. And lastly, relevant complaints or customer support data, which might highlight particular areas where a customer's interaction with you and your products or services is not going as hoped or expected. And of course, we recognize that what constitutes a risk or potential issue might differ across firms or communications. And these are just examples of where those might be found. Next slide, please. So if we've identified that testing might be appropriate to do, I think it's a reasonable next question of what are the possible ways to do it. And whilst this isn't an exhaustive list, I think 3 common approaches to testing are qualitative testing through things like interview or focus groups, surveys, and experimentation. Now, of course, different methods are better suited to different questions and each have their strengths and limitations. And as Joe mentioned, we're also very aware that practicalities like cost and expertise will determine what a proportionate approach looks like for different firms. But let me talk through each type of testing and the relative benefits. So first, qualitative testing, which I think really explores consumers' experiences and perspectives by speaking with customers. So this could include formal interviews or focus groups run by expert agencies, but it could also be a series of structured conversations you have with customers within an existing interaction. And qualitative testing is typically used to understand the reasons behind a behavior. So when we want to understand not only what does and doesn't work, but why. And it can be useful to help identify early issues too. So when you may not be sure the extent of a problem or what might be driving it. And Joe gave a really nice example of that in action earlier. The conversational nature of qualitative testing also lends itself to doing deep dive discussions with consumers into a particular issue or a particular communication, where you really want to get under the skin of a particular issue. But because sample sizes for qualitative testing are generally quite small, it's less suited for generating numeric metrics. So things like X% of people understood that, or for comparing in a really robust way differences between different types of consumers. Now, by comparison, surveys are a relatively simple way to get lots of insights by asking a sample of customers for feedback or responses via a questionnaire. And again, expert agencies can run surveys to generate lots of insights on behalf of firms. But surveys can also be developed in-house to evaluate understanding. And surveys often ask these quantitative questions which allow for measurement. So things like X% of people correctly understood this question, which can help to provide those helpful metrics to evidence understanding. And with enough participants, it can allow for really helpful comparisons of understanding levels between different groups of customers as well. But because surveys generally use predetermined questions and response options, they may be less suited to really open-ended questions or deep dive discussions. And it's sort of perhaps more useful when firms have a good idea of what the right set of questions are they want to ask and what they think the right possible responses might be. And lastly, experimentation. So things like A/B testing or randomized control trials, it fundamentally involves comparing different versions of something. And so it's useful in learning what works best, especially when the purpose is to understand things like, does an amended communication work better or is it clearer than an existing version? And much like surveys, they work well in generating numeric metrics for that comparison. But they can also be used to diagnose issues in understanding or to explore how different consumers make different decisions in light of information. So, for example, experiments could ask participants to adopt the role of different consumers or present them with different situations and see how they act. And you can then observe through experiments how consumers make choices in hypothetical but realistic environments. But as they increase in complexity, experiments also take more time and resource to implement. And of course, this means they may not be the most appropriate approach if quicker insights are required. Final slide, please. So before I hand over to Fairer Finance, I just want to finish on some practical considerations around if and how to test. So in considering the right approach, since we've discussed different methods are better suited to answering different questions, first asking yourself, what are the questions that I want answers to, may help you determine which method may be more or less suited to reaching your intended goal. And of course, it's also really important to consider the people you engage in testing, and especially that the people you test with are representative of the customers that a communication or customer journey is intended to reach. As Joe mentioned, proportionality really matters too. And as we've discussed, different methods require different levels of expertise. So for example, formal experimentation does require specialist knowledge of experimental design and statistical analysis. And of course, we acknowledge such approaches will not be proportionate for all firms. However, we do know that firms may have the capabilities to implement A/B testing and consider less formal test and learn approaches within their development and rollout of communications. And likewise, as we discussed, whilst qualitative and survey testing can be delivered formally by external agencies, less formal approaches to testing, like building evidence through testing within your existing consumer interactions, can still generate very useful insights. But of course, like everything, it's important to understand and acknowledge where there are limitations or risks from any testing you may be doing, as well as how you're interpreting and acting on those results. And lastly, some practical tips on how to maximize the value of testing understanding. So first, understanding is not a homogeneous issue. It doesn't always mean one thing. What might constitute understanding in one context might differ from another. And what consumers need to understand in order to achieve good outcomes might differ too. So you can ask yourself things like, is it enough for a customer to just be aware of something? Or do they really need to understand how it applies to them? And what might it mean for their situation? And considering what improved understanding looks like ahead of testing will allow you to design testing that's best suited to measuring and improving the outcomes that really matter. And finally, it can be easy for customers or participants to say they do understand something, but it doesn't always mean they genuinely do. And whilst perceptions of understanding can be really useful, actually measuring whether customers understand something, so for example, through multiple choice questions, which have correct and incorrect answers, can provide much more reassurance that consumers genuinely do understand. So I hope that very broad overview has given some useful insights to consider if, when and how it might be appropriate and proportionate to test. And with that, I hand over to Tim and Fairer Finance.
Brilliant. So we are going to look at a couple of case studies to bring this to life, and hopefully that will answer some of the questions in the chat already. I think it's important to start off with the fact that we shouldn't lose sight of what the consumer duty is all about. It's about delivering good customer outcomes. And actually, if we get overly obsessed on the clarity of particular communications, we could miss the fact that actually we're meant to be measuring whether people are behaving in line with the purpose of the product and getting great outcomes from that product. So it's not just about testing the process, it's about thinking about whether people are going to get excellent outcomes. And consumer testing is a helpful way of thinking about that. So behavioral science tells us that the way the information is framed, the choice architecture, influences the way that we process information and the choices we make, which is why we really get a lot of insight out of testing journeys. So on the next slide, we've got a couple of examples of where we've tested different journeys. And you can test journeys through qualitative or quantitative means. In one case, we wanted to get hard data on how consumers responded to different versions of questions in an application journey. So we ran an online survey with several thousand people in the target market recruited to do the survey, comparing how they responded to the different versions of the questions. And as a result, the firm was able to choose the best versions of those questions for their application journey. In another case, we wanted to understand exactly how certain vulnerable customers, and I should say these were some of the most vulnerable customers that you're likely to find, some of those really vulnerable customers, how they would navigate a new journey for an innovative product. So we did deep dive qualitative research with a sample of those customers, talking to them and watching them click as they click and read through the journey. As a result, we identified areas where the vulnerable customers were missing really important information. And as a result of that, the firm was able to improve their journey and make sure that vulnerable customers were going to understand what was going on in the journey. Now, we've also tested plenty of shorter communications, but we're often asked to look at the longer communications, T's and C's and policy wordings, because these can be a little bit trickier to get right. Now, the behavioural context is vital here. We are information foragers. People are not reading these documents front to back, top to bottom, left to right. We're using them as manuals, looking for particular information, looking for the signals for where that information might be held. We're only really turning to them if something goes wrong. And that means that we need to test in that environment. And that means that we actually find one-to-one depth interviews particularly effective for testing these longer documents. Now, these interviews are great at unlocking emotional responses. And our emotions, of course, are really important determinants of whether we engage with a document and how we engage with it. If your customer experiences a negative emotion when they open the T's and C's, such as feeling anxious, overwhelmed, or even helpless, then you've lost the battle already. They need to be feeling something more positive. They need to be feeling in control. Now, sometimes testing confirms, frankly, what we already knew or suspected about the document before we tested it. So, for example, if there's a section in the document that's full of legalese, customers won't be able to correctly answer comprehension questions about that section, and they're likely to feel disengaged and anxious. And if we're honest, we can probably spot legalese a mile off, and we didn't need to test that. But sometimes the testing tells us things we didn't already know. For example, highlighting that certain groups of customers with particular characteristics of vulnerability struggle to navigate the document in certain ways, and that actually certain types of additional signposting are helpful. Regardless, in both cases, we get a very clear steer on how to improve the document. Finally, then, on the next slide, we love a good behavioural experiment at Fairer Finance. Here's one that I was involved with for Tizer. Now, it's obviously important that customers understand the nature of the risk that they are taking when they invest their money, as opposed to leaving it in cash savings. However, the risk warnings used by many firms in the sector are not necessarily helpful. Take capital at risk, for example. Now, we always say that capital is jargon and at risk is vague. And actually, we found that jargon is particularly bad in the investment sector and is one of the causes of the gender investing gap. So cutting jargon is generally a good thing to do. But also, these risk warnings leave consumers thinking that investing is more risky than actually it might be in reality. The other problem with using capital at risk is that there's no nuance here if we use the same risk warning for all types of investment. We're not helping consumers understand the difference between investing in a particular stock and investing in a fund which is more diversified. So really important to get risk warnings right. And we wanted to test whether changing the risk warning would change how people behaved when it came to their investments. Now, we couldn't just run an A/B test, which is the gold standard. We couldn't just run that off the bat in the wild because we didn't know if the version of the risk warning we were testing would lead to good outcomes or bad outcomes. So we wanted to run it in a controlled hypothetical environment. And that's exactly what we did. So on the next slide, you can see how we did this. We tested an online survey on 3,000 people where they faced a journey which mimics the sort of journey that they would go through in reality, and they had to make a hypothetical choice about what they would do with £10,000. Now, some participants saw a journey containing a traditional risk warning, while other participants saw a more innovative risk warning. Now, the innovative risk warning basically explained that over longer periods of time, over 5 years, investing is likely to lead to higher returns than cash savings. All other aspects of the journey remain the same. And then on the next slide, you can see that actually changing just this one piece of information in the journey materially impacted people's choices, a small but significant increase in the amount of investing. And now this behavioral experiment gave the industry the confidence to run A/B tests on this kind of risk warning in the wild. Having done the behavioral experiment in a controlled environment, they then went out and applied it for real. And then on the next slide, we have an example of one of the firms that has done this. This is from Hargreaves Lansdown. They've published these results, so we can talk about them. They tested a longer risk warning on their website. Specifically, it said over a period of 5 years or more, investments will usually give you a higher return compared to cash savings. And what they saw as a result was a small but significant change in the amount of people opening ISAs and then the amount of people who are investing. Now, obviously, we need to make sure that those people are going to get good outcomes. But what this is a really good example of is how we started with some qualitative and quantitative research highlighting jargon was problematic. We then ran a behavioral experiment showing that there were likely to be better ways of communicating. And then there was an A/B test showing that people get good outcomes at the end of it. Just thought we would leave you then with a couple of our other top tips when it comes to consumer testing. Just going to pick out 3 of them for you now. And these are common mistakes which we see. So the first one is that we sometimes see providers testing the before and after versions of the same communication on the same person, the same participant. Now, this isn't the most robust way of doing consumer testing, because once you've seen the before, it's then going to bias your reaction to the after, or the other way around. So really, when we want to test the before and after to demonstrate that our communications are better, we want to test them on different consumers. Secondly, while it can be really helpful to have your own consumer panel, a panel of customers who respond very quickly to communications when you send them out, that's really helpful for getting quick responses. But the downside is if that's a small panel of customers who are reviewing your communications regularly, these customers stop being representative of your customer base because they are being educated on all your communications. And so actually the results that you might see from a regularly used customer panel is really an upper bound estimate on customer understanding. Other customers in your customer base probably understand a little bit less. And then lastly, we actually spend quite a lot of time telling providers that their communications don't need testing. Testing takes time to do it well, and it can be costly. But the good news is that lots of consumer testing has already been done across the sector. And sometimes we have a pretty good idea of how consumers are going to respond to the communications, what they're going to understand, how they're going to navigate the journey, and so on. And there's no point doing consumer testing as a tick box exercise when an expert review will get you there quicker and cheaper. And of course, after that, you can always test the before and after and demonstrate the improvement with consumers. With that, I'll hand back to Eve.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks, Joe and Cameron as well. I will just take down those slides because now we are ready to move into the discussion part of today's webinar. So please do continue leaving your questions in the Q&A and we'll try and cover as many of those as we can in the next half an hour. First, though, a couple of my own questions. So, Joe, you mentioned at the start of the session today around proportionality, and that's key to interpreting some of the FCA's guidance around when and how to test. But some smaller firms might be sitting here thinking we don't have the resource to carry out lots of consumer testing. So where should those smaller firms focus their attention?
Thanks, Eve. It's a really good question, and you're totally right to call out then that the GT requires a proportionate approach. I think one of the areas that smaller firms can try and concentrate on is looking at the highest risk communications and considering which might be the most appropriate to test and the methods that make sense to do that. And what do I mean by highest risk? Well, all of the factors that I set out up front in terms of what's the purpose of the communication? Is this about, taking action on money in your pension pot, for example, which could have some pretty long-term consequences? What's the context of the communication? Is it something that is trying to drive a particular outcome or behavior? What's the timing of the communication? Is it something that's going out, urgently? Is it something that is a frequent piece of communication that's a reminder or a prompt? And who's in your target market, what are their information needs, are really relevant to that decision to test or not. And crucially underpinning all of that, and this is something that Tim picked up on as well, what's the outcome that you want to see? What does a good outcome look like in this context for your consumers? So those are all some things to weigh up in terms of whether or not testing a particular communication out of the whole suite that you've got across the journey for a product or service in your firm makes sense. And there might be some other things that you'd look at as well in terms of kind of contextual data, I guess. So let's say you're receiving through your regular kind of outcomes monitoring a high number of complaints that customers don't understand something about your product, or there are particular exclusions that keep coming up time and time again that people have misunderstood. You might want to consider whether the information they're receiving about the product is understandable or coming at the right time. Sometimes testing might help with that. And there may also be, again, as Tim and Cameron pointed out, other factors that are preventing good understanding. So it might not always be that testing is the right answer, especially if you've tried it before, let's say, and you haven't necessarily found there's that straight line through to an improved outcome.
Great, thanks, Jo. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to a couple of those themes in the discussion. But Cameron, I also wanted to touch on some of the more technical aspects of testing and the different methods that you touched on in your part of the session. So you mentioned that surveys are really useful for getting feedback on journeys and communications. Is it enough to rely on surveys that firms might be sending to customers just after they've bought a product, for example?
Yes, it's a good question. I think, can these types of surveys be helpful? Yes, absolutely. I think, is it enough to provide reassurances that we're meeting good outcomes of consumer understanding across the entirety of the whole customer journey? Possibly not. And as discussed, think of the importance of consumer understanding across that whole customer journey. And so it's important that they understand key information before, during, as well as after the decision to take out a product, which extends beyond just, are they satisfied with the overall journey afterwards? And I think that sort of attitudes and awareness of sort of post-purchase and immediately after that purchase runs the risk, or may just be evaluating a small part of the customer journey. So I guess a good question to ask, what questions are we asking of customers at that point? And does it give us the confidence that that's really hitting those good outcomes across the entirety of the journey? It may be that there are other surveys or other points at which in that journey it's important to measure some of those outcomes too.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to, I guess, what Jo said about identifying where those potential pain points or key decision moments for customers might be is going to be the starting point here, really. Brilliant. So I think let's move on to some of the questions we've got in the chat, because we've got a lot of great questions in here. The first one, perhaps to you, Jo, we've got a question here asking if the FCA has examples of testing it has done on its own communications. Obviously, you're not a regulated firm, but does the FCA test its own communications?
Yeah, it's a great question, I think, and it's something that we consider all the time in terms of how we can best land the messages that we think we need to land with consumers. Cameron might also have some examples, but there's a particular one that springs to mind for me. Principally, obviously, we are communicating with firms directly a lot of the time, which will dictate the manner in which we do that, right? And we've got a lot of kind of statutory and legal responsibilities that colour how we frame things. Something that I'm sure many on this call are familiar with too, from what our rulebook requires. But we have launched in this calendar year what we call the FCA Firm Checker. So I'm sure lots of you are really familiar with the FCA register and how complex the presentation of some of the information on the register is. We wanted to build something that was expressly more usable by consumers to try to get help them get a handle on whether or not a firm is regulated or not, just as a really basic question. And we found that the way the FCA register works as a kind of underlying tool was really difficult for customers to engage with to do that. So we launched the firm checker as something that is directly for consumers to use. We did a lot of consumer testing throughout that process, and we also did regular analytics on the beta version of the firm checker whilst it was up for a while, to help refine it more and learn lessons about what consumers were finding and users were finding more or less difficult. So I think for me that's an example that stands out, but I don't know if Cameron, there's anything else that you would call to mind.
Well, yeah, I think maybe extending beyond that, I guess part of our role in the behavioural economics team at the FCA is to help the work that the FCA does be more behaviourally informed. And one of the ways in which we do that is do testing ourselves to help support some of the decisions that the FCA makes. And broadly, we do that in sort of two ways. So the first way is a bit more diagnostic, which is sort of helping and using research from behavioural economics and testing to feed evidence into shaping policy decisions. And we've done so recently, for example, with the recent HBR, the Advice Guidance Boundary Review consultation paper, where we ran some experiments which showed how different levels of information can help or hinder consumers' understanding of HBR. And that helps sort of shape some of the discussion points in the consultation paper. But we also do more sort of targeted intervention work, which is, you know, at the point at which we're making a policy decision, we use evidence from testing to help us learn what works best in terms of, you know, what the right policy outcome might be. And so we've got lots of examples over sort of the 10 years or so where we've sort of been using testing both to feed evidence into the kinds of considerations or understanding the problems that we might be grappling with as a regulator, but also in terms of learning how we might make policy to solve some of those issues as well.
Brilliant, thank you both. And just getting back to more the topic of customer testing, we've got a question here, which maybe I'll come to Tim first on. So I've asked, when trying to test new communications with customers, how would you recommend going about getting a real cross-section of a broad customer base, including customers who are completely disengaged or sceptical of financial services in general? So he said people that participate in voluntary focus groups could potentially give a skewed view. So Tim, do you want to start with this one, and then maybe I'll come to Cameron?
It's a really good question because it gets to the heart of one of the tricky issues with testing, which is selection bias. The people who select into being tested on may not be a truly representative sample of your customer base. And that's why it's really important to robustly design these things. It's always going to be something you have to wrestle with, but there are ways around it. Ultimately, working with recruitment agencies is really helpful. So we work with a few different recruitment agencies, and if they're really hard to challenge samples, ultimately you'll always end up with someone with a clipboard in a shopping centre going and finding people who have particular characteristics of vulnerability or particular demographics or whatever it is, who are willing to spend a couple of hours of their time talking through an in-depth interview with VeriFinance or a provider like that in return for a small amount of money. So ultimately, you can always find people who are in those sort of underrepresented groups, but it can take a little bit more time to do so.
And Cameron, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I'd perhaps add, you know, Tim's described a really sort of a good situation in which we're sort of trying to get really robust samples and really broad customer research. Now, of course, you know, for some firms, it might not be proportionate to do always those large scale surveys or consumer testing. I think even when you're considering smaller testing or more in-house testing, that consideration of, you know, how can I make sure that the customers I reach are representative, but also trying not to always rely on the same customers at all times. There is value in having consumer panels, as Tim identified, but ensuring that you get as broad a range of consumer views that are, you know, relevant for the kinds of issues and kinds of understanding you're looking at measuring is really important, whether you're doing it with 10,000 customers or with 20.
Great, so making sure it's representative of the likely customer base as well, I suppose. Great, so a question here about testing versus getting expert views here, and perhaps I'll come to you on this, Joe. So is regular primary research with customers required, or would review services like those offered by us at VeriFinance and other firms meet this requirement as well?
So I'm going to attempt to break my own record for answering a question with "it depends" as many times as possible during this session, but I think this is going to be one of those "it depends" questions again. If we come back to this idea that the kind of the what is it that you're trying to find out, and what is it that you're kind of seeing in terms of customer outcomes that might be suboptimal that you want to explore some more, and what have you tried in the past also to get over that hump or that hurdle. So in some cases you might be seeing that, you know, I talked before about this idea that you get a lot of complaints in a particular area, let's say, and you think what's going on with that, I need to explore it further. You might be able to do that kind of root cause analysis wise within the firm, full stop, and find that it's nothing to do with understanding. You might find that it is understanding related when you explore that a bit further, and that actually in the past you've done some direct customer testing, you try to change things, you thought you'd improve the outcomes through that test, but it doesn't look like it, and it might be time to call in some experts then as well, because they could lend a different perspective. Equally, it might come up as something that you've not tested before, a particular piece of communication, documentation that's going at a particular point in the journey that is something that you haven't put through testing previously, and you could gain something from that. So a lot of it's going to depend on the circumstance in which you find yourself, the context for the firm, and the kind of question that you're trying to answer, as to whether or not going customer testing route or by having conversations with a wider group might be more helpful.
Thanks, Jo. And I'll come to Tim on this next one, which is asking what the panel view on measuring and testing things like click, open rate of key documents, such as the IPID prior to a sale, and then using those learnings to improve the open rate, particularly referencing the FCA's Financial Lives survey in this question. So low customer engagement with IPIDs was a theme that came up. They said it's great to have a clear and simple document, but it's equally as important that customers are actually reading and engaging with those documents. So Tim, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, I think it's about having a really broad enough evidence base. And it needs to be broad because any particular type of evidence is going to be limited. So consumer testing is always going to be limited in the ways that we know. So selection bias, and consumers don't know what they don't know, and so forth. So you're going to need different types of evidence. And some of that might be from click rates, for example. I mean, I must say with IPIDs, they usually test very poorly, something to do with the design of them. And actually, even when people open them, there's a question over how much they engage and how much they take in. Probably if you're relying on the IPIDs to communicate something important, people are going to miss it in the journey, and it needs to be somewhere else in the journey. And for the people who do engage with the IPID, hopefully they'll be able to understand everything in a really easy way. But actually, loads of people aren't, and so we just need to, design the journey for the customers we have rather than the customers we wish we have, and put everything important in the journey in a layered way already.
And Jo, I wonder if you'd like to comment. Sorry, go ahead, Cameron.
Sure, yeah, no, I just wanted to add to that. It's as a behavioral economist, I'm sure Tim thinks about this a lot as well. It's an idea of triangulation. So it's, we've got multiple data points that we can gather through multiple different evidence sources. And I guess it's about thinking about how can we bring all of those together to tell the compelling story. Click-through rates, in some cases may be a necessary precursor for people to engage with information, but may not be sufficient to give us the confidence that they are actually being engaged with. It may also prompt the question, is the right place for that information to be behind a click-through email? Is there another stage in the customer journey where that might be important? So it's about taking these various data points from the different sources, of which consumer testing may just be one part, to try and sort of tell that story and give the greatest understanding of what consumers do and do not need to help them understand.
Thanks, Cameron. And Jo, was there anything you wanted to add to that one?
No, that's been covered perfectly from my perspective. Thank you.
Great. And just continuing on that theme, Cameron, on kind of perceptions of understanding perhaps being useful in some cases, but less useful in others. Someone has asked what level of evidence understanding is okay for testing. So 100% is unrealistic and disproportionate, especially for smaller firms and those with existing legacy disclosure requirements. And they've referenced some plain numbers research, particularly to do with APRs. But they've asked, where should firms draw the line of minimum acceptable testing results? I don't know if you want to have a go at that one first, Cameron.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, and I'm sure Jo will jump in as well. I mean, I think that, clearly the answer to this also depends. I think the questions rightly pointed out 100% is not necessarily expected or feasible. I suspect in lots of cases at the other end we will look and say, you may see a level of understanding and think that's clearly not enough for consumers at large to be making good decisions. But I think in terms of drawing a line or having a threshold, it really depends, not only in terms of, what's the right level of understanding for the right consumer and what constitutes good, but also in how you measure that. You ask an easy question, people are more likely to get it right than if you ask a more difficult question. And it comes down to, what the right question is, what that right level of understanding might be. But also the consumers and what they need to be able to do off the back of it. So I don't think there are necessarily prescriptive hard and fast rules to apply to say X% is good, but Y% is poor. But rather it's about what does it mean for them to understand within the context and within the situation. But Joe may have something to add on that.
Yeah, that's totally right. I think, another it depends answer. It depends what your baseline is as well, right? Where did you start? And I said up front that we're looking for some improvement through the GTE. So it's not about there's a threshold number, but how do you demonstrate improved outcomes through your kind of testing activity and then the actions you take afterwards? There are, as Cameron pointed out, all sorts of factors that would play into like what is the right number, what is the right threshold, what's the product, what's the target market, what's the information that you're giving the customer, and what do you need them to understand from it. So on that basis, we can't give a give a magic number, but we can say, did you see an improvement in where you were before or after the tested version? And from those insights, do you think it could be better still, actually, like what you've tested and changed? Keep going. Otherwise, your ongoing outcomes monitoring within the firm should really be helping you work through whether or not what you changed off the back of a particular test has made the difference that you wanted it to make.
I think, just to add to that, we're never going to have a world in which everyone understands everything about financial services, because everyone is always going to have cognitive limitations, biases, emotional responses. There are also going to remain people who, shock horror, aren't that interested in financial services, but remain customers, right? We're never going to get to 100% on these metrics. So it's about understanding where we're not at 100% and what else needs to happen. So you might improve a document, you might test it, you might get a metric up to 80%, say, which might benchmark really well against the sector. But actually, you're still worried that 1/5 of your customers don't understand something really important that you're going to need to go and change one of your journeys. So I think it's about what you do with the people who you're not getting to 100%.
Thanks, everyone. And just another question really on, some real life examples. So good and poor testing. And I'm guessing, Joe and Cameron are not going to want to necessarily name companies here. But Tim, perhaps you could talk through some good and poor examples we've seen through our work with some of the clients.
So I'm going to name a company, and I know I can name them because they were talking about this on a webinar just the other week, and that is Marker Study, who we supported to do some depth interviews on some of their policy wording. And actually, that was a really thoughtful exercise. We'd already worked on the communications, improved them an awful lot. But actually, when it came to testing, because we were testing on people with particular characteristics of vulnerability in a particularly deep way, one-to-one depth interviews, we were able to get new, rich insights, which has then informed what Marker Study has done with that document, then other documents as well. And actually, that's just one example, but there are loads of examples out there. I think a lot of firms have got some really good examples.
Great, thanks, Tim. And this is one for the FCA here. So Joe, I'll come to you on this. What is your view on co-creating content or documents with users or with customers? So thinking about design or plain language methods, is that viewed as a type of user testing?
Thanks. Really good question. And again, something that we speak to in the guidance as well, in terms of using, let's call it like more of an inclusive design approach. And in that, I think, again, we'll come back to this point about like the question will drive the method. So depending on what it is that you want to achieve as a firm, you may well find that this is an approach that can lend you a lot of useful input. One of the good examples that we've seen, for example, we've called out in a recent publication actually, is around debt advice. We saw one of our regulated debt advice firms partnering with a charity and a capacity building organisation that works in that sector, and going through some of their web forms that customers had to use to kind of in effect register their incomings and outgoings and what they were struggling with. And those, in order to get the help that they need, those forms were pretty complex and tricky. And through that work with this organization and with users, they were able to amend them and then see an increase in the percentage of people that went on to complete those forms and then get the help they needed. So can be a really beneficial approach, again, depending on the question that you're trying to answer within the firm.
Great, thank you. And perhaps another one for you here, Joe. So someone's asked about some of the mandatory language that the FCA requires firms to use. So much of the corporate language, they've asked, is shaped by FCA requirements, especially around disclosures, footers, and regulatory phrasing. But they've said, we also hear consistently from consumers that this language feels inaccessible or disengaging. So what's the FCA's current stance on balancing regulatory clarity with consumer understanding, and how is the industry responding to that tension?
Yeah, it's a great tension to call out, and it's a really fair one, and it's certainly something that we heard a lot about in our call for input on simplification of our requirements that we issued at the back end of last year, and that we've set out really recently, in fact just at the start of last week, a couple of areas in which we're going to look at simplification of some of our rules and requirements in the handbook in order to give a bit more, I guess freedom is the right word, to firms to be able to communicate at the right point in the journey using the right type of language. So we signalled that attached to the Treasury's work on the Consumer Credit Act, we'll be looking at areas of our handbook there, and that we'll also look at some areas around communication in retail banking as well. So I think in the meantime, because obviously changes take a while to wash through, look out for our consultations and those mechanisms by which we're asking for input on that, because we really want to hear what the particular areas of tension are, struggles that firms have found, things that they think would work better, so that we can feed that into our approach. But equally, if you've got kind of significant issues and you think, I really could make this work better, but I feel I am hampered by X or Y requirement, let us know. We'd really like to hear that and try to figure out what the right balance is. So yeah, a really open door and a very receptive place for that type of feedback at the moment, because what we want to drive through the duty is greater understanding and those better outcomes. And if there's stuff that feels like it's getting in the way of that, then we can assess it and determine whether or not the balance is in the right place.
And one thing to add to that, as someone bearing the scars of many a heated debate over whether some legal wording is required, sometimes it is, sure, but actually oftentimes it isn't, and there's a perception that it is. Capital at risk being an example, actually it's never been required to say that. And actually, when you dig beneath the surface of a lot of these required disclosures, some of them are not as mandatory as you think in terms of the exact wording, and you might have more flexibility than you think. So it's always worth pulling on that thread.
Totally right.
Thanks, Tim and Joe. And we've got another question here, really speaking to kind of testing documents specifically. Someone's asked, how would you test the intelligibility of legal documents to ensure they're understandable to their intended audience? So Tim, we spoke a bit about testing lengthy T's and C's and how that's a bit different to testing, day-to-day letters that firms might send out and emails. So what are some of the key things for firms to think about with these testing projects?
Well, ultimately, if you focus on objective comprehension questions with a right and a wrong answer, then we will see whether people could navigate to that part of the document and could understand what they needed to do in a particular situation, or what their responsibility was in a particular situation. So that's definitely one way. And another way is through reviewing the language and the intelligibility of the language, the understandability of the language, how much jargon there is, for example, are key concepts explained really clearly, is the meaning really coming through loud and clear. So there's lots you can do without needing to do consumer testing on that one as well, but it is certainly tricky on those legal documents, and the sector has made good improvement in some areas, and there's a lot of room still to go.
Thanks, Tim. Another couple of questions here. I think we've got a couple of minutes left, so we'll get through these. One for Joe here, again on this topic of firms with limited resources. Someone's asked, is it more effective to continually test and refine a single communication until it meets a high standard, or to focus on improving a broader range of communications to a better level? So Joe, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get you some sort of it depends gong, I think, Eve, for when I answer these questions. But I think it's a really good question, right? And I think actually coming back to a point that I made earlier on ongoing outcomes monitoring, I think that might help a firm in that situation take a decision about what the right approach to take there is. So looking at one communication and carrying on and on and on with that versus a whole suite of them, what are you seeing in terms of consumer outcomes for the product or the service that you offer? Are consumers broadly getting what you intended them to get, or are there difficulties? And then how do some of those communications play into that? If you see that there's a really good case, then when you look at those outcomes, that in fact this one particular area of communication, which is like, let's say it's a renewal document that they get every single time, and you really want them to understand that or whatever, is the right thing for you to focus on, and that's borne out by your data and your evidence within your firm, then that seems like a perfectly reasonable approach, right? If you find instead, however, that there are a suite of other things that are going on and they're all dictated by other types of communication that the firm offers, then you might want to consider again through that lens of like, what's the purpose of those communications? What's the context? What's the timeline? What are the information needs of your customers? Whether or not you should be looking at some of those instead.
Thanks, Joe. So it's about having a really good picture of the whole sort of end-to-end journey and when those communications are going to be delivered. Great. So we've got an insurance question here. So someone's asked, what would you consider an MGA's responsibilities to be in relation to testing if they have no direct relationship with the final customer? So Joe, I don't know if you'd like to go for that one as well.
Yeah, sorry, I missed a bit with the acronym. Sorry,
an MGA.
Okay, so but the point here, I think what we're really getting at is what happens when you don't have a direct relationship with the end customer. So I'll come back again to this kind of, like reasonable and appropriate bit that's in the rules for a very good reason on that front. There will clearly be some pieces of information. I'm assuming this is about kind of, a product manufacturer that puts something out there that other people are then going to sell on. There will be some really important pieces of information that are going to go on to the distributors that will then go into the hands of the end retail consumer that need to be well understood. And then in other cases, it may be that there are some other pieces of information that are kind of going to go onto the distributor, but they're less material to the end consumer. So those are the things on which you're going to need to make a judgment. I don't think I can kind of give a view right now that says, oh yeah, you definitely do or you definitely don't. But what significance does this piece of information that you want to get through and you want understood by the end consumer, if you're making that product, hold? And so, and what's the best way for you to ensure that the consumer at the end of the chain will understand that? I don't know if you've got any experience, in fact, Tim, of working with firms in that area and kind of how you've approached that.
Our experience is that the way that the manufacturer or co-manufacturer communicates to the distributors is probably how the distributors are going to communicate with the customers. And actually, it's really helpful to think through, if this was copied and pasted, or if this was just sent straight on as an attachment or whatever, will end users still be able to use it? And I think that probably leads to better consumer outcomes.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Cameron. And thanks, Joe. I think that brings us pretty much to our time today. So I'll hand back over to James to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eve. And thanks again to Joe and Cameron. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be making a copy of the slides and the recording from today's webinar available on our website later in the week. And if you'd like us to send you the pack or the link, please do get in touch. If we didn't get your questions today, we'll try and get back to you by email over the next few days. And of course, if you'd like a longer chat with us about any of the topics discussed today, please do get in touch. That is it. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back with another webinar in a few months. But obviously, if you can't wait for that, you can listen to Tim, Eve, and me discussing the latest regulatory news on our podcast. Another plug for it. Can't get enough of it. But thanks again, and have a good rest of your week. Bye for now.